Okay, today we're looking at Jeff McMahan's theory, which is the Embodied Mind account. Jeff McMahan was a graduate student of Derek Parfit's, and he is name-checked as being very helpful in the beginning of Reasons and Persons, and is obviously very influenced by Derek Parfit. He writes in a similar style and has similar kind of examples. You know, it's very dense, lots of argument, lots of examples. I like that style of philosophy writing. I mean, certainly contrast with Nagel. We read a bit of Nagel earlier in the class, and I find that much heavier going. So even though there's a lot going on here, each part is very straightforward, and I like the lots of examples. So I appreciate the way Jeff McMahan writes. And I've also actually interviewed him. If you want to see what he's like, I've got a video where I interviewed him actually this year in January. Very nice guy. He's an American, but he's in Oxford, which is where he was a graduate student with Derek Parfit. So what he does in the two readings that I've given you, the first one is called the psychological account, and that's a sort of critical assessment of the theory of personal identity that Parfit starts out by defending. So if you remember, Parfit kind of does two things. First of all, he defends something like John Locke's version of personal identity against famous criticisms of it, and says, if you're interested in personal identity, this is the best account. But then, having done that, he then says, but personal identity is not what matters. The most important case there, example there, of course, is my division, where the two halves of the brain are put in two different bodies. And it looks like if just one of them survived, then you would continue to survive. You know, if you have a stroke so that one hemisphere of your brain dies, you continue to survive. It's still you. So if just one hemisphere of your brain survived, then you would survive. But if both hemispheres survive and go on to exist independently, then it looks like, according to a theory of personal identity, you can't survive just because identity is a one-to-one relation. So if there's just, lefty survives, which is your left hemisphere, then you survive. Or if just righty survives, then you survive. But if lefty and righty both survive and go on to be independent, then lefty is not the same as righty, so they can't be you. Because if you are lefty and you are righty, well, then they would be the same by the rules of identity. If U equals lefty and U equals righty, then lefty equals righty. Just like if, A equals B and B equals C, then C equals A. But clearly lefty and righty are two distinct individuals, so they don't equal each other, so neither of them can be you by the rules of personal identity. But, as Parfit points out, that's kind of silly. Why should double success count as failure? So what that means is that personal identity is not what matters. So you can separate, one of the effects of Parfit's discussion is you can separate the question of what am I? Am I, for example, my body, or am I my mind? Am I some psychological entity? And there are competing accounts of that. But Parfit says, so Parfit sort of sides with the psychological account. He says that that's much more important. And that's what Locke sides with. Locke actually talks about both a body theory and a psychological account. Or specifically, he distinguishes between the human being and the person. And he says we're both of them. As a human being, we're an organism that begins at conception, let's say. If you use the term human being, then you might want to say that we don't begin at conception, because that's just a single cell, and human being is a more sophisticated entity. But let's just talk about organism. We're certainly an organism which, if you have to give a beginning to it, you would say conception. And then if you had to give an end to it, you'd say, when I die, when life leaves this body. So that's the length of time the organism exists. However, there is also this entity which Locke called person, whose existence is shorter. It doesn't go all the way back to conception, because one of the things that Locke says about the person is that the person must be self-conscious. That is, not just conscious. So conscious, if you're conscious, you're aware of stuff. You can feel pain, for example. But self-conscious is something more sophisticated than that. So, for example, you might say, I don't know, a fish can certainly feel pain, but is probably not self-conscious. I think they give animals a test for self-consciousness, which is, can they recognize themselves in the mirror? And higher animals can. For example, an elephant, if you without it noticing, you paint a spot on its forehead, and then you put a mirror in front of it, it will sort of lift its trunk up and touch it. So it recognizes that that's me in the mirror, and there's something weird on my forehead. So that seems to demonstrate self-consciousness. But something like a very young baby is not self-conscious. Conscious, yes, because certainly a baby can feel pain, but not self-conscious. Okay, so self-consciousness is important because for Locke, the person, it has moral value and is capable, not only has moral value, but is a fitting subject for praise or blame. So if a person does something wrong, they should be blamed. If a mere organism does something wrong, as for example a shark eating a surfer, it's stupid to put the shark on trial or praise or blame it, because it's not capable of moral behavior. Whereas a person is sophisticated enough to at least be capable of both being morally valuable, that is, we should care what happens to persons, and also, if it's sophisticated enough, it can also be a moral agent as well. It can be somebody who we could say, you have moral duties and you can be blamed for not following them. So Locke makes this distinction between the living organism and the person, and says the person is more important. And since, well, he certainly says it has logical, moral status. Since Locke's time, people have followed Locke, and they've certainly insisted that persons are the more important thing. So, for example, neo-Lockeans, modern Lockeans, tend to answer the question, what am I? With the answer, I am a person, not I am a human being. Whereas there is another camp that tend to be called animalists these days. One of the most dogged defenders of animalism is a guy called Erik Olson, who has written at least a couple of books on the subject. And I've interviewed him as well, if you want to see what he's like. He's in Sheffield, also in England. And he says, on the contrary, we're the human being, we're not the person. The people who argue for animalism tend to come at it from a metaphysics standpoint. They tend to say, well, what is the basic stuff of the universe, and what is the basic stuff of which we are made? So they're not really immediately interested in moral matters, whereas the people who tend to say that we're persons are more interested in what we value. So Locke was sort of tackled this question, but in particular, he was also more interested, and a lot of people who've written on this since are more interested in the question of, what is it that it takes for me to persist through time? So what makes this being at this time the same individual as this being at the former time? And of course, if you remember, Parfit's answer is relation R. That is, there's a psychological connection between these two, such that the later one remembers the earlier one, and the later one is carrying out the intentions of the earlier one. So there's this kind of relation that holds between them. If that relation is severed, then they're not the same individual. So I've got a little chart here to illustrate the difference. the body theorist, or the animalist, for example, although you can get into the weeds here. Animalism is slightly different from a body theory, because people who defend the body theory would say, when I die, the corpse is still me. A body theorist says, you literally will be burying me. That thing is me, even though it's dead. Whereas an animalist would say, once I die, I don't exist. So the body is just what remains of me, but it's not actually me. So there is a difference. But for now, let's say the physical, if you're interested in the organism, call it the body theory. Now, do I survive using the transporter? Now, if you remember, it is Parfit who goes on about the transporter, and he says, what happens in the transporter is it basically destroys me atom by atom, then it makes a complete duplicate of me that is atom for atom identical on Mars. And that person on Mars has all of my memories and all of my personalities. So, for example, I can start a sentence, I press the button, and the thing that appears on Mars will continue the sentence. I will start a thought, the person on Mars will continue that thought, will finish that thought for me. So according to Parfit, you do survive the transporter. Not everybody who has a psychological account would necessarily, let's say, with a wide account. That is, Parfit says relation R can come in various levels. Like, for example, he says you can have the wide account of relation R. That is, relation R holds with any cause. That is, so what is the reason why the person on Mars stands in relation R with the original on Earth? It's because of this, because all the information was sent through space. So the cause of the presence of the thoughts in the mind of this new person on Mars involves technology and stuff. Whereas the normal cause, on the narrow account, it has to be the normal cause. So what is the reason that I stand in relation R to me 10 minutes ago? It's because the ideas persisted in my brain. The normal cause is the continued presence of one brain. And Jeff McMahan is going to argue for the narrow account. He's not going to agree with the wide account. He's going to say, yes, relation R is what's important, but it's got to be in the same brain. That's what he means by the embodied mind. The mind is what's important. The psychology, the psychological connections are what matters. But in order for those to be there for the right reasons, they have to be there because a brain, the same brain that had them earlier, is having them now. So Jeff McMahan would say you don't survive the transporter. And the body theory in general says you don't survive the transporter. The body theorists tend to like the branch line story, where, because that seems to give you the intuition that it's not you. That, the branch line one is you push the button and you don't disappear on Earth. It makes a duplicate on Mars without destroying the original on Earth. And the original on Earth suddenly thinks, oh, that's not me. And it was never me on Mars because I don't survive transport. It just makes a copy that thinks it's me, but it's not really me. I hope you followed that. Okay, what about brainwipe? Well, this is like the story that Bernard Williams came up with, where you are told that two things are going to happen to you. First of all, you're going to be tortured tomorrow. So you think, oh shit. But he says, but before that happens, I'm going to remove all psychological connections by tinkering with your brain. And I'm going to replace all of your personality and memories with Napoleon's personalities and memories. So if you believe the psychological account, you would think, okay, well, it's not going to be me that's tortured tomorrow. It's going to be Napoleon, because the being that gets tortured tomorrow doesn't stand in relation R to me, because you've removed all the memories and the personality and replaced them with Napoleon's. It's going to be Napoleon that gets tortured tomorrow. Phew, you think. But what he says is, no, you don't actually think that. You think, I'm going to be tortured tomorrow and I'm going to have my brain wiped. So that's a good thought experiment that seems to support the body account. So the body theory says you do survive the brain wipe. And how do we know that you think that you survived the brain wipe? Because you still fear the torture that's coming, even though, according to the psychological account, that's not you that's going to be tortured, because it's not going to have any of your memories and so on. All right, well, where does McMahon come down in this? Well, initially, he is supportive of Parfit. I mean, he thinks, Jeff McMahon is a huge Parfit fan. He thinks he's a genius, but that doesn't stop him disagreeing with him on several key points. It's like what Aristotle said about Plato. He said, I love Plato, but I love the truth more. So where does he differ? Well, the first thing to point out is that you can categorize the answers to these questions. What am I? You might say this is related to the question of identity. Am I a person? Am I a human being? What's the right answer? What matters? Now, what does this mean? Well, another way of putting the question is, what should I care about in the future? So this question, you might say, the answer to this question, when you're talking about across time, is what am I? It's asking, is there something in the future that is me? And if so, what makes it me? Parfit would say, relation R non-branching. That's his theory of personal identity. Now, what matters? Remember, it's one of Parfit's contributions that Jeff McMahon says is one of his most important, is showing that these are two separate things. And what matters can be different from what am I, and the key example for this is the my division case. Because then according to the best theory of personal identity, neither lefty nor righty, remember these two people with half my brain, each of them has half my brain, according to the theory of personal identity, because identity must be non-branching, neither of them is me. But nonetheless, I should care about what happens to both of them, because what's important about them is relation R, and both of them stand in relation R to the original me. So the way that Jeff McMahon puts this distinction is he says, this is a question of identity, and this is a question of what he calls egoistic concern. That's his terminology. So egoistic concern means you're addressing the question of what matters. Now, as he rightly points out, this is misleading because the word egoistic sounds like it's talking about what happens to me, because ego means me. So he says, really, instead of egoistic concern, I should call it special egoistic-like concern. He says this on page 42. Page 42 of this book, which you will see in reverse, it's called The Ethics of Killing. Jeff McMahon himself drew this picture, rather macabre picture, which is a baby pulling at the birth caul in the socket of a giant skull. It would be, maybe Jeff McMahon should have illustrated horror movie posters. So the question, egoistic concern, he defines it like this on page 41. Each of us has a special sort of concern for his or her future. We anticipate our own future experiences, fearing future pains and looking forward to future pleasures, in a way that is different from our attitude to the future experiences of others. Let us call this special type of concern about the future egoistic concern. it may seem to be a necessary truth that identity is a necessary condition of justified egoistic concern. In other words, it needs to be someone in the future that is suffering. It needs to be that the person in the future who is suffering is me, for me to care in this special kind of way. Now notice, it's not saying that we're automatically selfish. We can certainly care about other people in the future suffering. Certainly you can care about your own children suffering after you're dead. That's fine. But there's a special difference between caring about other people suffering and caring about yourself suffering, because for the other people you can't anticipate the pain, whereas if it's you anticipate that will be my pain, and you don't have to care about it. Maybe you don't mind pain, but you anticipate it. That's what egoistic concern is. And it says, it may seem to be a necessary truth that identity is a necessary condition of justified egoistic concern. It needs to be me for me to anticipate the pain being mine. But what Parfit showed with my division is that it doesn't have to be identity. You can have egoistic. I should anticipate the pains that lefty feels and the pains that righty feels, even though neither of them is me. Now, having drawn that distinction, Jeff McMahon goes to great lengths to talk separately about the psychological account, which is, sort of Parfit's theory of personal identity, and the psychological account of egoistic concern. And then when he gives his theory of the embodied mind theory of identity and the embodied mind theory of egoistic concern. But he then wants to make sure that they overlap as much as possible. He does agree that they will be different in the case of fission, which is division. He says that's one case where Parfit is absolutely right, where identity and egoistic concern are going to separate. And he says it's also true of fusion, and there's one other case where if I transplant memory tissue, that's going to be different too. But he wants to bring them closely together. Erik Olson, the animalist guy, actually agrees, although he disagrees with Parfit. Parfit says we're a person, Erik Olson says we're a human being, but he agrees with Parfit in saying that these questions differ. So, I asked Erik Olson, okay, you say we're a human being. That means we exist from conception. Does that mean you're opposed to abortion? Because abortion would be the killing of a pre-person, let's say. So if you believe that we are a person, you don't think necessarily, you can be okay with abortion, because you can say what you're killing is not what matters, it's not a person. Whereas if you're an animalist, it looks like you should be opposed to abortion. But Erik Olson says, no, I got no problem with abortion, because I draw a distinction between saying what I am and what matters. And in fact, he might agree that what matters to me is what happens to the person. So I might not care what happens to me if you wiped my brain. And he said that might be perfectly rational. It's you, but that doesn't mean you have to care about you. So there are some people who, Parfit and Olson, even though they disagree about a lot of things, would agree that these two questions can come apart. Whereas what McMahon seems to be doing is trying to make sure that they overlap as much as possible. All right, so let's look at some of the examples that McMahon uses and explain the implications of them. So, on this diagram you can see I've included in the gap between the beginning of human being and the beginning of person, there can occur a pre-person. All right, what is a pre-person? Well, remember, to be a person, you have to be self-conscious. But it is possible to be conscious without being self-conscious. And a pre-person is a stage where presumably a fetus is conscious, has awareness, can feel pain or whatever, but doesn't lay down memories. That is, so no later stage of this organism will remember the experiences had by this pre-person. They're sort of on a little conscious island. They are conscious, they can feel pain, but they're not a person because they're not self-conscious, and you can't say there is that they persist any length of time. A person can persist through time by later stages of it remembering the earlier stages, but nothing can remember this pre-person. And similarly, you can have a post-person. So notice that Alzheimer's kicks in here. Now, once Alzheimer's kicks in, you start forgetting things, and eventually it reaches the point so that before you die, if it's very severe, late-stage Alzheimer's, you have a human being who is aware, can suffer, but has no connection with previous states of that organism. So at this stage, the post-person can feel pain, but has no memories at all of being former people. This is a bit like Clive Waring. Clive Waring is a very famous case. If you want to see what he looks like, there have been documentaries about him. Go to YouTube and enter his name. You can see him. I find it very sad. I don't know if I should or what that says about my intuitions, but something happened to his brain. He had a kind of encephalitis or something, such that he cannot remember anything more than a few seconds. If you've seen the movie Memento, and if you haven't seen the movie Memento, you have to see it because it's a great movie. The best movie by the guy who directed that Batman trilogy and Inception and all those. None of those are as good as Memento. In Memento, there's a character that can remember like 5 minutes, and after that, he can't remember. Well, Clive Waring, it's less than that. So he keeps a diary where he says, "Now I am awake for the first time," and it says that again and again and again. So there is no connection between between certain states of Clive Waring's consciousness. He can't recall anything of earlier things that happened to him. Of course, it's complicated because he can talk English, so he retains skills. And one of the weird things about him is that he's a musicologist, and he can play a long piece of music uninterrupted, even though, of course, he presumably can't remember starting the piece of music, but he can play the music, so it's kind of interesting. There's also something called Korsakoff's syndrome, which is a similar phenomenon. Clive Waring, I guess, doesn't have that, but it's very similar. Korsakoff syndrome is very much like that, where you're isolated and you can't form memories. Now, why does he bring these up? Well, he says that they're kind of awkward for the psychological account. So, looking at, let's just go again over the definition of person, which he gives on page 45. As I use the term, a person is a being with a rich and complex mental life, a mental life of a higher order of sophistication. Parfit has a similar understanding. He stipulates that to be a person, a being must be self-conscious, aware of its identity and its continued existence over time. This is why persons have moral worth, as I said. So in the abortion debate, it's often phrased as you can have an abortion so long as the fetus is not a person. And it's not a person if you define person in this way. So people who are opposed to abortion either say that you don't have to be a person for killing you to be wrong, or they have a different definition of person. Where are we? Being must be self-conscious, aware of its identity and its continued existence over time. It follows that psychological continuity cannot obtain within the life of a non-person. Because psychological continuity, which if you remember from Parfit, is the chain of memories and relation R, basically. Psychological continuity cannot obtain within the life of a non-person. If this is right, the psychological account implies that we are essentially persons. So what am I? I am a person. Am I an organism? Well, yes, but not essentially. So it's like saying, normally we would, biologically, it seems better to say that we are essentially human beings, and we are only accidentally, which doesn't mean happening by accident, it just means non-essentially. We are only accidentally, say, the height or weight that we are. We could have been different and we could have remained ourselves, but we couldn't have been a goldfish and been ourselves. So your essential properties are what make you you, such that if you lost that property, you would no longer be you. So your hair color is not an essential property. If you dye your hair blue, you haven't ceased to be you, you're just you with blue hair. But it looks like, so if you believe the psychological account, you say, if I cease to be a person, it wouldn't be me. So in other words, it would say, I was not conceived. I came into existence sometime either, maybe even after birth. Here I've had person extend before birth, but actually if you define person strictly enough as they're doing, you would actually start being a person after birth, because even a newborn baby is not really self-conscious. So in other words, if that's the case, then if I am essentially a person, then I wasn't born, because I didn't exist when the organism, that is the vessel for me, was born. The organism is not me. It predates me and it will postdate me. My existence is between these lines. So if the psychological account that says you have to be capable of psychological continuity to persist through time, and anything that is not capable of psychological continuity therefore cannot be a person, well, this can't be me. So, understood this way, person becomes a substance sortal. That is, a kind of thing. A person is a kind of stuff. Persons exist. So a substance sortal is a thing that is sort of, substance literally means the thing that exists underneath and holds other things together. So we normally talk about stuff, which is substance, and the properties of stuff. So red is not a substance, it's a quality of a substance. It's something, so red can't exist without stuff that is red. So it's the stuff that is a substance sortal. And it sounds like, according to the psychological account, its implication is that we're a kind of stuff. But the thing about kind of stuff is that you can't be two kinds of stuff. So if person is a kind of stuff, then what is this human being? I can't be, either a human being is not a kind of stuff, is not a substance, or it looks like psychological account implies that I'm two things, that there are two things existing here right now. There's a person, that is me, but there's also an organism. And then there's a question, well, which one of them is thinking? If they're both thinking, then are there two thoughts? You know, I'm thinking, what shall I have for dinner? Are there two instances of that thought? The thought that is made by the person and the thought that is made by the organism. And I'm only the person, so what's this organism? Who is that? It creates all these difficulties of a kind of metaphysical nature. And this is the kind of thing that animalists use to argue that, in fact, I can't be a person. Person is not a substance sortal. It is what's called a phase sortal. So a phase sortal is like something like teenager. Teenagers exist, but they exist as phases of something more basic. A teenager is a phase in the existence of human being. It's not a substance by itself. Whereas what the animalist would say is persons can exist, but they're just stages in the existence of a more basic kind of thing, which is the human being. Whereas that's not what the psychological account seems to suggest. And these kinds of entities, pre-person and post-person, McMahon suggests create problems for the psychological account because it's a conscious thing, but it's not a person. So this exists, and then I come along as a person. What happened to this? Is it a distinct entity from me? Is it an entity with its own status that is unconnected to mine? It's kind of weird. It's a weird implication. He goes on page 46. If the organism can literally become a person, as happens here, then the person must simply be a phase in the history of the organism. Phase must be a phase sortal rather than a substance sortal, which is incompatible with the psychological account. He also wants to bring up the notion of persistence through time of a kind of lower level than the psychological account would count as persistence through time. So he talks about his dog on page 50. The degree of psychological connectedness from day to day within the life of a higher non-human animal may be quite weak. Yet overlapping chains of weak connectedness seem sufficient for what matters. So, for example, when Parfit talks about relation R, he says, for relation R to hold from moment to moment, there must be at least 50% of your memories remaining. So, for example, if I forget 49% of my memories, it's still enough for relation R to hold through time. Now, what he suggests is that with a dog, the relations are too weak to count as relation R. Dogs don't remember much from moment to moment. They do remember you, but they don't remember, they have no conception of their future. They're not necessarily self-conscious. Their mental life is much shallower than ours. There's a much lower amount of psychological unity that he's going to define in a bit. But enough for what matters. Enough of a connection for what matters. So he's leading up to diluting the psychological account. So his embodied mind account is going to say that we can expand. So the embodied mind is going to actually end up being broader, being somewhere between. So embodied mind. Going to end up being somewhere between human being and person, because it's going to capture at least most post-persons and pre-persons as well. Over any given day in the life of my dog, for example, there are fewer than half the number of psychological connections that hold over a day in the life of a normal adult human being. But even this relatively weak degree of psychological unity in my dog's life seems a sufficient basis for me to care for the dog's own sake now about what happens to it in the future. So what he wants to say is that he wants to adapt the psychological account of egoistic concern. He says he wants to revise it. And he says, this is on page 50, I suggest that the psychological account of egoistic concern be revised to hold that what matters are psychological connectedness and broad psychological continuity. And that's going to include any degree of, so if you remember, you don't have to remember 50% of your memories, you can remember like 1% of your memories, so long as there's any connection. Now, having said that, so that looks like it's going to be much more forgiving account of what matters, and it's going to include the pre-person and the post-person. However, he is going to also demand that the brain persists. So remember I said that Parfit thinks you can survive teletransportation. McMahon is going to argue, no, if that was possible, you wouldn't survive. And he goes through a series of examples that are quite interesting. So starting on page 57, the suicide mission. In a time of war, one has been chosen to carry out a military mission that will involve certain death. Although the operation of the replicator is very expensive and has therefore been strictly rationed, one's superiors have granted one the privilege of having a replica of oneself made prior to the mission. They will also allow one to choose prior to the process of replication whether one will go on the mission oneself or whether the replica will be sent. Now, according to Parfit, it should make no difference which one gets sent. And what McMahon says is, come on, we all know we would send the replica. Why? Because replication, relation R by itself with a wide cause doesn't cut it. The only way that we care about that egoistic concern matters is relation R with its normal cause, which requires that it be carried out by the existence of the same brain. So if you made a replica of me, I just won't care about it. So he says, if Parfit had tried to make his point about what am I and what matters diverging, instead of using my division, where you do keep both hemispheres of your brain, they're just given to different people, that works because the brain continue to exist, and that's why it's convincing. But what's not convincing is if you're replicated twice. You won't care about either of them, says McMahon. We don't care about replication because the original brain is not there. So again, that's why he says the embodied mind is what counts. It has to be in the same brain. The memories must survive in the same brain. Another one to illustrate this is the nuclear attack on page 58. One is an employee of the Pentagon, which has a replicator capable of transmitting one's cellular blueprint to a replicating booth in Alaska. Actually, no, this makes a different point. One receives confirmation about the nuclear missile targeted on the Pentagon. It's penetrated the country's defenses and will obliterate the entire area within a minute. Current events are making this scarily plausible. That is just enough time to have oneself scanned and for the data to be transmitted to Alaska. Now, what he will admit is we probably do that. We would probably much rather the data be transmitted to Alaska than not. So we do care a little bit about the existence of our replica. So we care that somebody exists that remembers being us, but we don't have the right, we don't anticipate being able to have the experiences that replica experiences. It will have experiences that are not ours. One more point, unintended replication. Imagine a replicator produces an exact copy of us without that, just by accident. It's not using our blueprint. He said Parfit, according to his theory, should accept that as being just as good as transportation. In other words, Parfit should accept, so long as it has relation R to us, in other words, if it has our memories and it thinks it's us, that should be enough, and it doesn't matter how it's caused. But he says that shows a weakness with Parfit's theory because it does matter how it's caused, and it's got to be caused by being in the same brain. Now, the cure. I can't remember what the point of that one is. Let's check that one out. We skipped over deprogramming. Where is the cure? Yes, deprogramming is the brain wipe that Williams came up with. Oh yes, the cure comes much later. The cure, page 77. Imagine that you're 20 years old and are diagnosed with a disease that, if untreated, invariably causes death. Within 5 years, there is a treatment that reliably cures the disease, but also as a side effect causes total retrograde amnesia and radical personality change. Long-term studies of others who've had the treatment show that they always go on to have long and happy lives, though these lives are informed by desires and values that differ profoundly from the person had prior to treatment. Blah, blah, blah. Would it be egoistically rational for you to take the treatment? Most of us would be at least skeptical of the wisdom of taking the treatment, and many would be deeply opposed to it. And what I suggest that the best explanation for this reluctance to take the cure, so either you die or you take this cure that involves complete eradication of any psychological connections. If you're a body theorist and you say that the persistence of the body is what I am, and you think that that's what matters as well, what matters is that the body continues. Bernard Williams presumably is one of the people who thinks this, because he thinks that even if all of my mind is wiped and replaced with Napoleon's personality, then I have reason to fear being tortured tomorrow, then you would take the cure. You would have no problem taking the cure. Whereas what Parfit says is that, what McMahon says is that you wouldn't, and that shows that Parfit was right, that psychological unity is what counts, is important. So, now, he also goes on to talk a fair bit about brains, about how brains can be talked about in various different ways. So we can talk about the organization of the brain, the functional organization, and where is that? Physical, yes, in page 68. 3 forms of continuity of the brain: physical continuity, functional continuity, and organizational structural continuity. And he says, according to the Embodied Mind account, the criterion of personal identity is physical, it's got to be made of the same stuff, and minimal functional continuity of the brain. He says this on page 69. The reason why organizational doesn't matter as much is because he wants to make sure that we're including the post person. Okay, so what is the upshot of the changes that McMahon is making? He says he wants to broaden what counts as me to a certain extent. That is, he wants to, and this is what you can see here, he doesn't want to require that for me, for what counts as me and for what I should care about, he doesn't want to require that they be self-conscious. He wants it to include, he says that we have reason to fear pain of the late stage Alzheimer's post-person, even though it's a post-person, it's not necessarily a person. So we are not essentially persons. We can pre-exist the emerging of a person, and we can post-exist it. So in that sense, his view includes more of our organization, of our organismal life than Parfit's. But in another sense, it's narrower, in that it requires the existence of our brain, and duplication by a transporter isn't good enough. Parfit says if we transport, that's me. McMahon would say, no, it's not me, because it's not my brain. It's just a copy of my brain. My brain, it has to be my brain in order to be me. Now, having made this account, the main point of making this account in this book is so that he can then go on and discuss issues of killing and death, like abortion, like euthanasia. He wants to have an account of what matters, what I should care about, and what has moral value, so that he can talk about what kind of deaths are bad deaths and what kind of deaths are deaths that are not deaths that we should necessarily worry about. And one thing that is going to be relevant is, even though I might have reason for to have egoistic concern about this future me, it isn't necessarily as bad if this person this being, which is a post-person, dies, than if this being, which is a person, dies, because only the person can have time-relative interests. So, his dog, for example, not being a person, doesn't have strong time-relative interests. If they have time-relative interests, they have them weakly. And for that reason, it's not as bad if a dog dies, because you are not frustrating interests. Your dog doesn't have a conception of the future, for example. You're not frustrating desires the dog has about how they're going to live their life in the future. And the same thing will be true of a fetus. The fetus, even though it may be conscious, doesn't have a conception of the future, and therefore it's not as bad to kill a pre-person, even though that might be that might be a being that would be the same being as a person later. It's not necessarily as bad if it dies as it would if the person dies. So that's what he's going to get into. All right, that's Jeff McMahan. We'll probably return and look at some of his theories on death and killing later in the course.